So this is a part two in a series that I've started last time I talked on transformational tools. Jan and I, we've sort of realized, with our retirement coming up, we only have so many more talks. And so my desire is to use the times that I'm able to speak to you to share the tools that I have found most helpful for me on my transformational journey. And so last time I talked about the power of the heart and how when we establish heart-centered coherence, when we begin to link that coherence with an understanding that that relationship with our brain creates a kind of harmony, a kind of entrainment, that we actualize all the great things about our capacity to really be present in our way of being with what's happening in our life when we open our hearts, when we get in touch with that dimension of ourself that feels connected to a greater reality than what's just simply happening in the outer. And we looked at the heart as being not just a physical pump, but also has its own brain, has its own intelligence that's independent of our brain. And we also learned that when the heart is not coherent, in other words, when we're stressed out, or when we're emotionally altered, triggered by something that's happening in the world. Of course, we have lots of opportunities for that to happen multiple times in any given day. But when we're incoherent within our energetic field, that incoherence translates into stress and different dynamics in our brain. And our brain becomes compartmentalized, the hemispheres don't communicate with each other as well. And so much benefit can come when we simply recognize that we have the capacity to regulate our state. In other words, we can be with whatever we're having independent of how whatever we're having is unto us. In other words, while it appears as if the things that happen in our life affect us, they do, and especially when we're triggered, but what we also need to recognize is that we can override that circuitry, that conditioning, and we can bring into our experience our capacities to really use what's happening in the moment to really transform our life and to really make a positive difference in our world. And so as we look at transformational tools, they're helping us to transcend the limits that we're experiencing in any given moment. Of course, we understand that any limit that we're experiencing in part comes from a belief that we have about ourselves. And so everything in us that is seeking to transcend or free ourselves from the limitations of what's happening in our world, we require the tools. And so today's talk is looking at the transformational tool of meditation. And my talk title is Think Not on These Things. And so it's kind of indicative of one of our primary challenges, and that is recognizing that we think ourselves into discomfort. We think ourselves into the stories that define us or limit us or are against us. And so we have to recognize that because we are thinking, because we're conscious beings, that when we're not conscious of how that process, the mechanism of ourself, does what it does, perception and meaning making is a function of our mind-body process. But if we don't understand that the circuits of perception and meaning making can become conditioned, and therefore the thoughts and the feelings that we have can seem as if they create our reality, and they do. So we have to begin to have the capacity to recognize what's going on when we are not conscious and begin to interrupt those circuits that define us and begin to reprogram that aspect of ourself that is seeking to live in a more holistic and conscious way. So as we look at Scripture to help us recognize that this is a problem for all of us, and as Jesus looked at his effort to teach his disciples about that dimension within that he called Abba, the Father, his higher self, he recognized that we talk ourselves out of our sense of essence, or our sense of being divine. And so when Jesus says, take no thought for your life, take no anxious thought, he is wanting us to recognize that it is our thoughts that can take us out of our relationship to the divine, our beliefs. And if we don't know how to manage the discomforts of how we're having our life, we will believe that life happens to us instead of life happens through us. We will live in a sense of victimhood and not recognize our capacity to be the one unto our life, unto the world. Jesus says, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap. They neither store in barns. And yet our Heavenly Father feeds them as well, takes care of. And so there needs to be a recognition that there's a mechanism that has nothing to do with the outer, but lives as the eternal essence of what life is really about. It's there to provide us with everything that is needed, necessary, and good. If we can access that dimension of ourself that is connected to that dimension of abundance, that dimension of source, that dimension of substance. We have to access that. And we access that through the cognitive capacities that awaken, that activate the non-corporeal dimension of our essence, of our self, the energetic consciousness that is our reality, as well as the limited self, our ego self. So, you know, in my way of thinking, it all boils down to, and I love the title of this book from Dr. Joe, it all boils down to breaking the habit of being myself. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Who are you in the habit of being in your life? Are you in the habit of being not enough? Are you in the habit of being inadequate, unworthy? And so when we recognize that we are in the habit of being ourselves, and it seems as if that just runs our world perfectly, or at least it doesn't necessarily feel perfect in the sense of it boiling down to, okay, if this is my life and if I'm in part co-creating what I'm having, then I have to examine the circuits that bring forth that personal reality. I have to understand how that happens if I'm to transform or if I'm to transcend what's going on, my self-imposed limitations. And so as we look at Dr. Joe's approach to, first of all, interrupting the circuits that keep us locked into our self-imposed limitation, then we need to understand how can we go inside and do that deeper work to reprogram or recondition ourselves to a different reality of our ideal self, as Dr. Joe describes. And so I got a movie coming up, Caleb, and we're going to hear Dr. Joe talk about what we need to do with this part of us that is kind of living in separation, living in the disconnect. Check this out.
Thoughts are the language of the brain, and feelings are the language of the body. And as people get caught in this cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking, over time, they condition their body to memorize that emotion as well as the conscious mind. And whenever the body knows as well as the mind, that's called a habit. A habit is when your body is the mind. Now, 95% of who you are by the time you're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors, a set of emotional reactions, beliefs, perceptions, attitudes that run just like a computer program. So 5% of your conscious mind begins to work against 95% of what you've memorized. So the person wants to think positively, but they're feeling negatively. They want to create their dream board, and put up their future life, but they feel unworthy. That's mind and body in opposition. We have to recondition the body to a new mind. So how many people here know someone who's memorized suffering? Doesn't have to be you, it could be anybody. Most people wait for what? Crisis or trauma or disease or loss or or diagnosis to really want to change. They wait to the point where the ego is brought to such a low level that they cannot go on business as usual any longer. That's when we begin to look at how we're thinking or what we believe or how we act or our attitude or what emotions we're living by. And my message is, why wait? We can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, which tends to be the human model, or we can learn and change in a state of joy and inspiration. Now, you want to learn the hardest part about all of this? You ready? The hardest part of all of this. The hardest part of all of this is making the time to do it. That's it. That's it. Making time for your precious self.
So, making time for our precious self. And so what is that making time of our precious self? Well, it's meditation. And so we're going to explore that a bit. Dr. Joe says this: meditation allows us to change our brains, our bodies, and state of being. Most important, we can make these changes without having to take any physical action or have any interaction with the external environment. Through meditation, we can install the necessary neurological hardware of our ideal self. I really like that. I really like the idea is that we can install the neurological hardware of our ideal self, so it's our ideal self that are running those circuits of our self system. And so as we kind of explore, well, how can meditation, how can developing our attention and awareness as we explore the internal dimension of ourself, how can that expand our consciousness into a dimension of reality that can have influence on what's happening in the outer world? That's where we're going with this. So part of the challenge and part of what we have to recognize is that meditation is a practice that has many different aims, but if we boil it down, basically it's to override the sense of separation. Let us just say, very simply, let us just have that the aim of meditation, the aim of sitting down, closing our eyes, establishing heart-centered coherence and brain entrainment, for sitting down and then exploring an activity of observing our mind as it struggles to kind of deal with the inactivity of just sitting and watching and breathing and noticing. That we get in touch with there is somebody inside that's running things, and we can kind of identify our separate self or our unconscious self as being there's somebody, someone, something, somewhere, and sometime. That basically encapsulates our sense of separate self. And as we look at habit, as we look at the body becoming the mind, in other words, there is a dimension of our unconscious self that lives us unconsciously and perfectly well. As a matter of fact, our brain prefers that approach to just let the habits, the circuits of having, doing, having, being, all of these different things that build up and become the way in which we make meaning, the way in which we project onto the screen of life what's happening. We just need to recognize that these circuits create a kind of sleep, an autopilot that keeps us from really bringing to the present moment those greater gifts that can only emerge when we recognize that there's somebody in here that's not tethered to our past, not tethered to these circuits. I mean, think about your habits of being. Do you know somebody who's in the habit of being negative? And they don't know it. They don't kind of know themselves as negative, but you can tell that they're in the habit of being negative. How about an unconscious habit of doing? Have you done anything unconsciously lately, like unconscious spending or unconscious eating, or just unconscious thinking about what's going on in your life, being run by that unconscious dynamic of whatever it is that you're doing just to do it? Can you think of a habit of having that kind of runs you when you're not awake? How you're having something, being the habit of having something being against us. We know people who are like that. Sometimes we're like that. Be in the habit of feeling a certain way, feeling not okay, feeling less than. Being in the habit of believing that I don't measure up, believing that I'm not worthy. Being in the habit, the unconscious habit of perceiving, seeing the glass is half empty, or seeing the world that's divided. All these conditioned aspects of our separate self have to be understood as being what we're trying to use meditation to kind of acknowledge that this is not me. This is what runs me when I'm not awake, when I'm not conscious, because we have to still use these circuits. We still have to be, do, have, feel, believe, and perceive, but we don't have to have the unconscious conditioning being what is the content of those ways, but rather we have to recognize that there is a dimension of ourself that is not tethered to these circuits. And so now let's look at a different approach. What if we be in the question, how can we, I got my slides mixed up. Before I go there, let me just finish this. So Dr. Joe talks about the reconditioning of a new mind to the body. And so basically he's saying that this new mind needs to be untethered to our past. This new mind must be informed by our higher self. This new mind must be greater than the environment. In other words, we have to have this new mind that's capable of not being modulated by the external world. Imagine such a thing. Wouldn't you like to have a mind like that? And then finally, a mind that is centered in brain-heart coherence. And so there's a lot that we can do just in the activity of meditation that is about developing these neurological circuits that function from this context. It's just that we have to recognize that this is the work, this is the job that we have to embrace, and then we have to be clear as to how that occurs and what we're after when we do it. And so the renewing of our mind happens through the practice of meditation. And so as we think about, well, what am I seeking to affect when I'm trying to meditate? And so the very first thing, of course, is just being able to sit for 10 minutes or longer and just be able to let the body experience inactivity without falling asleep. And then once we are able to condition the body to be in the experience, the physical experience of meditation, then we can do some things with our attention awareness that can only happen when the body is settled, the nervous system is settled. When I taught martial arts, as a black belt, you're able to do things that the white belts can't do, primarily because they don't have the flexibility, they don't have the conditioning. And so while the technique lives in an advanced application of the art, the actual experience of getting to that advanced level requires the very basics of being able to be flexible, to be limber, to be able to accommodate the physical experience of the practice. And so meditation is this way as well. So now let's look at the internal aims. Once we're settled and able to sit, what are we after in this experience? So we start off with being somebody, someone, something, somewhere, and sometime. That's sort of our separate self. But how can we be in that separate awareness and then move into a more expanded self that transcends whatever is in the dynamic of the habits of being associated with one's separate self? So let's now look at the principle of interbeing and recognize that while the outer world doesn't necessarily give us a glimpse unless we look at nature, unless we go to the macro or micro view, we don't see the oneness, we don't see the interconnection. But when we look at the three-dimensional external world, we look at separate objects. But there is a reality that we know that while we're somebody, there is everybody. And we can connect up to that felt experience of knowing that we're a part of everybody. And we can, even though we're in our own separate identity, I'm someone, we can connect up to the experience of everyone and recognize that that's the greater reality. That's not just a woo-woo principle, that's a real dynamic that we can feel ourselves into. We can feel ourselves into being a part of everything. That there's nothing that is out there that we're not a part of, that we don't share in. And when we recognize that we can feel what that's like through practicing, bringing that awareness, feeling that connection, to feel like we can be connected to everywhere, in all time, enables us to step into an experience of an expanded self that frees us from those conditioned aspects of our separate self, being someone, something, somewhere, and sometime. So that's one aspect of meditation, especially loving-kindness meditation, ho'oponopono meditation. These kinds of meditation practices connect us up to the inner beingness, the oneness, the wholeness of all of life. But that's one dimension, and now we have to swing to the other dimension that is non-corporeal, that there's no physical component to it, but it's the void, it's the field of infinite possibilities, it's source, it's the 0 point. And in that dimension of the field, there's a part of us that is nobody, that is no one, that is no thing, that is nowhere, in no time. There is a part of us right now that occupies this dimension. Jesus called it the kingdom of God. We can call it the field of infinite possibilities. We can call it divine substance. It's this invisible potentiality that arises, that is behind all of the manifest realm. And when we are able to enter into, and therefore, our separate self is still around. We can find it. We don't lose anything by untethering our awareness to our sense of self, our identity, our roles, even our dreams. If we can let go of that and enter into and experience what it's like to feel connected to a potentiality that is wanting to express itself, what happens when we step out of that meditation is we step into a different experience of ourself, where we can be anybody, where we can be anyone, anywhere, anything, anytime. We can enter into the experience of what we've called being the one. But being the one means we step out of being someone, something, somewhere, and sometime, and recognize that the Spirit of God is seeking to live and express itself through us, and we have to get out of the way. We've got to get out of the way for that to happen. And meditation gives us the capacity to begin to develop the circuits that become connected to and feel into these dimensions of the field, of the one, of interbeing. And we can't get there just by reading a book. We have to get there by being in the practice of sitting with ourselves. And at the first discovering what every beginner discovers, and that is there's a lot of crap going on in there. And we got to recognize that until we develop the capacity to monitor and to watch and to observe where we are within this spectrum, and if we find ourselves in separation, being something, someone, somewhere, and sometime, we have to recognize, okay, that's my separate self. And now I'm being run by the circuits of my unconscious self system. And so I have to free myself from that limitation and enter into the energetic, felt experience of either the field or interbeing so that I can be the one. All right. So the picture of the little church there is the first Unity church that I ever walked into when I was 20 years old, 50 years ago. And this was the church of my girlfriend, my first wife at the time, who became my first wife. And in the course of dating her, I discovered that her father, who is the president of the board of trustees of this church, meditated. And back then, 20 years old, remember, I'm a child of the 60s, and so all I know about meditation is the Beatles and drugs, and so I couldn't imagine in the context of a Western church, Christian church, there would be this dynamic of meditation. It just was so interesting and intriguing to me. And that's how I got into unity, because my first wife's father meditated, and I was so enthralled by that reality. And so what drew me in even deeper happened later, when in my second lifetime, I married a Buddhist, and she took me to meditation retreats. These were 7 to 21 day retreats. It was all vegetarian. I suffered tremendously in these retreats. The two gentlemen that you see on the screen is Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein, and they were my meditation teachers. And the gentleman, the Burmese man, also in the picture, was their meditation teachers. His name was Manindra. So we had a chance to host Manindra, their meditation teachers, at our house in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We were sponsoring a meditation, a Vipassana meditation retreat at a convent in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Not Tulsa, Oklahoma, Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he came to our house, and so you can imagine my trepidation of having not only the teachers of our teacher come. I'm a meat eater. I have all these Western habits, and so I found myself somewhat reluctant and embarrassed, but yet excited at the same time. And much to my amazement, he would come, and he was a presence. The first time I ever felt a presence in another individual. But anyway, we went shopping in the grocery store, and we were buying food because we don't know what Burmese meditation master eats. And so I lost him in the grocery store, and finally I found him over in the meat department. And he picked up a thing of chicken. He said, "I want this chicken." I said, "But Manindra, you're a vegetarian. It's okay, it's not a vegetable. I mean, it's okay, it's not chicken anymore. It's something else," is what he wanted. What he was trying to tell me is that the reality of this has changed. And so anyway, the point of that story is that I was so amazed by what someone who dedicated his life to a practice could attain in terms of what he was able to bring into this world. Suffice to say that Vipassana meditation, which I became as I did in martial arts, I became someone who was dedicated and devoted to this practice, spent many weeks in meditation retreats, and very basically it's just mindfulness, it's just observing the breath, primarily focusing on the sensation of the gap between the in and the out breath, and just working with what comes up when you sit for many hours and you just focus on your breath and you bring it back every time your mind wanders. And by the way, that phenomenon of the mind wandering is called in the Buddhist tradition monkey mind. And if you're a meditator, you experience this, especially as a beginner. But it's important to know that when the mind gets distracted, the brain does that routinely. As a matter of fact, we are hardwired for distraction every 14 seconds. There's a phenomenon associated with how our attention works. We have to work against that. We have to recondition the circuits to enable us to stay focused longer than 14 seconds. And so it's best to think of meditation, especially in the beginning, as if you're training a puppy to go on the paper. And so we have all had the opportunity, for those of us who are dog lovers, to go through that discipline of training the dog to go where it's supposed to go. And we know what happens when we're not a very good trainer, that doesn't work. And so it's a very similar situation for dealing with our own fleeting consciousness. We have to put it back on the paper every time it gets off. We have to put it back on the object of our observation, and every time we get distracted. And eventually, over time, we'll be able to fix our gaze on on an individual object and then find ourselves deepening into that experience, and through a phenomenon associated with deep concentration, we can transcend our current waking reality. So there are things that we can experience that have a way of helping us move into a greater experience of our transformational capacity. And so for many of us, those of us who are part of New Thought, most of us come in having some kind of meditation practice. Some of us have had meditation practices and we've kind of gotten out of the swing of things. And yet there's a need to reiterate for everyone, especially the beginners, that this is a tool that we have to cultivate. It should be a part of the job description of being on the transition team of the world. Is that if you're not a meditator, you're not connected to that dimension of yourself that is here as the one to make the difference. And so here is just a bit of instruction for those of you who are beginners. So first of all, it's important to find a time and a place. Perhaps the best is the same time, the same place for a sitting practice. So sit for 10 minutes and increase the time as you're able. And use a timer, because you don't want, and especially in the beginning, to close your eyes and then be wondering when 10 minutes is up, because you'll be doing that rather than focusing on observing your breath, especially as time goes on. Time becomes distorted in the beginning of meditation. And after a while, advanced meditators can meditate for 2 hours, and it just seems like it goes by in just a flash. The second step here is to sit comfortably, and posture is important. Insofar as making sure your spine is straight, your head is extended up a little bit so your shoulders can drop, as if your spine is an antenna, and just keeping that posture so it allows for an energetic flow to happen in a better way. And then to begin to do some heart-centered breathing, cultivate the vagus nerve, stimulate the vagus nerve, and begin to develop that heart-brain coherence. Feel yourself connected to everybody, everyone, everything, everywhere, in all times, and go through that process of just feeling into that awareness. So this is important. You might ask, well, what do you mean feel into the awareness of one's connection to everybody? Well, the rational mind doesn't want to do that because it doesn't know how to do that, or it makes up some kind of story. Well, why are you making this stuff up? But when we actually be in the awareness that we are really connected to everybody, it's just that we're not conscious. We don't feel that connection, and begin to feel it. And in the beginning, you don't feel anything, but you have to build a bridge. You have to begin to feel your body, feel the sensation of your skin, and then feel connected to the space that you're in and the space that surrounds you. So there's a way of building this connection, but it has to have practice, and you have to have intent behind it. The operative word is feel as opposed to think. You're noticing and you're feeling into the moment as opposed to thinking or wondering about stuff. And then shift your focus to noticing the gap between the breaths, so you then have a target to begin to practice, recognizing that it's normal for you to be distracted. The practice is to, when you are distracted, to bring your attention back. So that's all that a beginner needs to focus on, is bringing your attention back when you notice that you're distracted. You will be distracted, but it's the effort to bring your attention back to the present moment, to the target. And if you don't want to focus on the gap between the breath, you can use a mantra, you can use a different sensation. It's just whatever you use, just be in the early stages of training the little puppy in your head, the little monkey mind, and bring it back. Each time you bring it back, then eventually the body becomes reconditioned to that practice. And once you recondition the body to the meditation practice, then you can enter into these other dimensions of our internal self that really can then matter in relationship to how we're showing up in the world. And then finally, repeat and rinse often. Now, repeat the practice each day, increasing your time by 5 minutes each week. So as we wrap this up, as Jane comes forth, as we get ready to take it to heart, just want to recognize that we're looking at spiritual transformational tools. And so next time I speak in 2 weeks, we're going to look at the transformational tool called the Q process.
Oh, I think I've heard about that before. Yes. Well, thank you. You know, it's always a good reminder for me when I remember about breaking the habit of being myself and, you know, remembering that, you know, I might think something that I want to see created, but if the feeling is not jiving with it, it's going to run the show. And so really looking at how I have been thinking one thing but feeling another lately. And when that happens, I just kind of get my wheels stuck. You know, I just feel like I'm not making any difference, or that there's no hope, or, you know, something like that. And so it's a great reminder. And I love the whole idea of installing new neurological hardware. There's something really cool about that. And that it happens through the heart. It happens through feeling, gratitude, appreciation. It's something we can all practice. And it occurred to me that in this time of separation, we may be separated from our loved ones. I can't see my grandchildren at the moment, and it's just causing me lots of grief, I'll tell you. That this is what I'm doing, though, is practicing that loving kindness meditation and consciously surrounding them in my love. And it's a way for us to experience the connection that is the true reality while we're in this feeling of separation. And so, thank you for the reminder.
You're welcome.